Fine.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Super. There we go. All right. All right. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see some of you and see your names for others. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad after us, this is, I think, our third attempt, isn't it, to do this? After our third attempt, we're finally getting going on this. And my hope and prayer is that it will help us personally and help our churches be healthy, safe places, particularly for the vulnerable, for those with less power, and will be aware and alert and diligent in making them safe places. As well as for those who have been wounded, right? We want our churches to be places where people can process wounding from the past and find healing. And so I'm thrilled that Mike Sloan is with us here today to do our grace training. I thought I would start just with a personal story on this, and that is back, wow, almost 30 years ago now. I was on the staff of a church, not Free Methodist. This was before I was a Free Methodist, growing mega church. We had a dynamic, charismatic youth pastor. We were seeing people come to Christ. The youth ministry was a couple hundred kids. It was going beautifully, and the pastor was a pedophile. And when all of that hit, and I think talk about how we've come a long way. I mean, I couldn't even wrap my head around that at that point. There were no outside organizations. We looked for somebody to come help, and the best we could do was find a woman who'd written a book about her own experience who would step in and help churches. But there weren't organizations like Grace at that point. This was the 90s. And but the thing that I carried away from that was recognizing that I had thought I kind of knew what a pedophile would look like or feel like, right? Like I thought they'd be creepy and I'd be able to sort of pick up on it internally. And that just wasn't the case at all. And so certainly there were things we missed as a church. We had no training, right? We were oblivious. But all that to say is I'm thankful for organizations like Grace. I'm thankful that Grace is here to do training, and I'm thankful that we have learned more and more about this over the past number of decades. My thoughts this morning regarding, us doing this is when you look at the life of Jesus, he was he fought those who had wrong power, and he defended those. He defended the weak. And so that's really the heart of what we want to be talking about today is how do we be like Jesus to kids, to vulnerable adults, to people who have been wounded. And so I'm thankful that Mike is here to do some training. So let me pray for us all, okay? Lord Jesus, I thank you for Grace. I thank you for Mike. I thank you for our churches. I thank you for everybody who's here. And Lord, I pray that we would be attentive to your spirit today. And that we would be attentive to Mike's words today, and that you would help us know and understand how to see our churches be healing places, healthy places, safe places. Lord, help us to stay attentive to any thing that you want to point out in our systems, in our churches, in our people, that just doesn't feel right, doesn't smell right, or just needs to be changed for the future. Just needs to be adjusted and changed so that we can continue to grow to be more and more the places that you desire us to be, the body of Christ, where healing takes place in the body. I pray for Mike as he's got a lot of stuff to take us through today, and I ask that your spirit would be walking with him, and I ask that you'd be keeping all of us alert as well. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Pam. I really appreciate it. It's really wonderful to be with you all today. I'm going to start my screen share. Can everyone see that okay? All right. So as Pam said, I'm Mike Sloan. I'm the Director of Safeguarding at Grace. Grace is a long, clunky acronym for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. We are a Christian nonprofit ministry. We started in 2004. And since that time, we've worked with hundreds of churches on issues of training, policy development. We've conducted independent investigations and assessments, and we do a lot of independent consultation on a weekly basis with churches who are in the midst of very difficult circumstances. My background, just a little bit about me. I'm here in Virginia, so wonderful to be with you all. And as I understand it, most of you are in New York State, maybe a few in Pennsylvania. Wonderful to be with you. It is sunshining. The sunshine is beaming down here in Virginia, and I'm glad to hear reports of that up your way. My background is I grew up in the church, and in church, we didn't really talk about these issues. And I suspect for many of us, that's part of our experience. We didn't have firm policies. We didn't have a lot of training for many of us growing up in church. And then I entered into ministry, and I was a pastor, ordained pastor, clergy for 10 years in 2 different churches. And the reason I do this work, one of the main reasons, is that I was in a wonderful seminary and had wonderful ministry internships and training and entered ministry. And yet, just like Pam expressed a moment ago, I did not have deeper training and responsible training with the tools that I needed as a leader to support effective prevention and response in the community. So once I received training very early on as a pastor, once I entered ministry, that really shook me that we're not doing more in this area. And I sought out more and more resources and better training. And I was gripped by the need in this area. And so once I was able to gain more education, gain more understanding of these issues, because as a pastor, I understand and care deeply about churches, it was God provided a path for me to begin to work with churches and train churches. And that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. So I review policies for churches on a weekly basis. I consult with churches, with my colleagues in the midst of difficult circumstances on a weekly basis. And I'm training churches again on a weekly basis. And so that's just a little bit of where I'm coming from today and where our organization is coming from. So it's a real privilege to be with you all as church leaders and meet you and help you continue the good work you're already doing in this area. Our simple mission at Grace is to educate and empower churches to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. And of course, that's going to be a key part of our training today. We're going to be working through some educational elements, certainly. Some of the things will be very familiar to you already. Some of them will stretch you and give you new categories and language, I hope. But certainly a big part of this is you're here in your role as a leader. And that's really one of our main goals for today, is that you receive empowerment and encouragement and support and practical tools for you to continue cultivating and shaping a culture of prevention and response where those are effective within your local church. That's our main goal for this training today. In any type of training, we need to begin with a conversation, a training about heavy topics, a training about abuse of power. It's important to just stop and take a moment to talk about self-care as we enter into this training today. So in a room, even a virtual room of any size, statistically, we know there are going to be survivors present. And it's very important for us as leaders to understand that we must respect a survivor's agency, essentially, their decision of when they talk about their personal story if they are a survivor of abuse. And so even though today we're going to have a lot of interaction, we're going to walk through a lot of scenarios and key questions together, and all of that will be voluntary in terms of your interaction and participation. It just needs to be said, first of all, that no one is going to be put on the spot today in terms of their personal story if you are a survivor of abuse. And for us as leaders, it's critical that we are not pressing or prompting people to talk about their personal story before they're ready to do so, in a place where they feel safe, where they feel they can trust the person they're ready to open up to. For some survivors, they're just never to that point, and that's okay. For us as leaders, we need to understand that dynamic and respect it. So I just want to say that at the outset. and to say, for any of us, even if we're not a survivor of abuse in one form or another, the weightiness of this topic at times will challenge us. And so we just want to make sure that we're encouraging everyone here to practice good self-care throughout. Nothing is more important than making your health and mental health a priority. So if you find yourself feeling upset or anxious or having a hard time focusing, if you just need to stand up and stretch and move around, that's wonderful. That's encouraged. We will take breaks throughout. There will be 4 main segments of the training today, but even if we're not on a break, please move around as needed. Take a break, stretch. And if you do just need to take a break, we're recording the training for this very purpose. You can step away and take a walk or go connect to something that is helping you be calm and find some rejuvenation. Now, that said, I've talked to trauma therapists about what are some techniques we can all use or be aware of that can help us stay calm when we're talking about hard things. And some of the ones that I find most helpful and simple are trauma therapists will say, if you just hold, I have some water here, very cold water. If you just hold something very cold or very hot in your hand, so some of you have your coffee or tea, if you just hold that in your hand, there's a physiological response in our bodies that helps keep us calm. Another technique is whatever beverage you have, if you have one, is to take a sip and swish it around your mouth and swallow. And it engages our physiology in such a way that, again, that very simple act can help keep us calm in the moment. Of course, we're all aware, I'm sure, of just doing some deep breathing or feeling our feet, putting our feet flat on the floor and focus on feeling our weight in our feet or in our chair or our back against our chair, whatever the case may be. Just feeling grounded in that way can help us stay calm and present. So use those techniques or others that you find helpful. And I will say that even with those techniques in mind, the goal of this training is not to have anything graphic or shocking that is intended to scare you or surprise you in any way. There's not going to be pictures of, children with bruises or anything of that nature. That said, we are going to have frank discussion of and examples of abuse of power in church settings. And so we'll talk through some very hard issues. But again, nothing will be intended to be overly graphic in any way. And I will end the training today with one more sermon on self-care as we leave this training, because you will need to attend to that and what your body needs and what your spirit needs and what your emotions are saying to you in the next few days and as you process a lot of the things you're hearing today. All right. And as we said, we will have interaction. Now, some of you will put some questions, I imagine, in the chat. I think Katrina and others are going to maybe kind of collect some of those questions. I will stop at various points and say if anybody has a particular question, now would be a good time. I'm going to prompt discussion, as I said, and certainly on a Zoom, like in an in-person training, I would encourage everyone to just raise your hand and interrupt, raise your hand and call on you and have a question, even in the midst of our training at any point. On a Zoom discussion, because I can't see the chat with the share screen, I do want you to encourage to put questions in the chat. I will encourage you to unmute and just say, hey, Mike, hey, Mike, and I will stop. And I would love for you to interject a question at any point. So most of you will probably not feel comfortable doing that, and that's fine. But as I said, we'll make room for questions throughout, and we'll make room for questions at the end. But you do have my permission to interject and say, hey, Mike, and then I'll call on you and we'll talk through the questions. Okay, one more preliminary thing before we dive in, and that is some of you are note takers like me. And there's going to be a lot of content today. And I just want you to take a deep breath if you're a note taker and be assured that all of these slides and the information on these slides is going to be made available to you so that you can go back to certain points or write down. You don't have to jot down every bullet point on a certain slide. these will be made available to you. All right. Anything else, Pam or Katrina, before we dive in? Anything else logistically? So as we said, will be 4 parts of this training. We'll take a break for lunch. We'll take breaks between the segments as well. So I will track that, and our first break is coming up here in about 45 minutes at 11. Anything else before we dive in?
Katrina and I can also keep track of, we'll try and flag if there's things coming in on the chat window. So for those of you who are a little hesitant to say, hey, Mike, we'll try and stay alert to that as well.
That's right. Absolutely. Okay, perfect. All right, everyone, here we go. So in part 1 of this training, we're just going to talk about some of the realities surrounding issues of abuse in the church and develop some common language, common definitions, and go through some statistics. Some of us are already well aware of those. And then we'll work on some recognizing common dynamics and basics of how prevention works in a church setting. And then we're going to end this first segment by talking through a particular framework that we found helpful to give to church leaders, a framework that helps us account for the main areas in our role as leaders for promoting or cultivating a strong culture of prevention and response within a church community. So that's where our first, now we're going to come to other key issues related to abuse in other parts of the training, like caring for survivors, like how do we recognize concerning behavior, tactics that those who abuse power use. What about issues of reporting and other response issues? We're going to come to all of those, but we're going to start here with these basic ideas. And I always love starting a training by putting these issues in the words of our Christian faith and using the words of Jesus. So very famously, Jesus said, in a particular context, warning about those who have leadership responsibilities in a faith community, but are bad actors. Jesus famously said, they come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. What Jesus is doing here, essentially, and I don't know if you've ever thought about it this way, Jesus is teaching basic abuse dynamics. If you listen to those who teach and research abuse, they will start to talk about the very things that Jesus is talking about here. Here, Jesus is talking about someone who is known by everyone in the faith community, someone who holds power and trust over others in some sort of leadership position. And he's talking about, yes, someone who has ill intentions, who is a bad actor, and who is targeting someone who's more vulnerable. But yet they're not openly showing their true colors. They are carefully cultivating a perception of themselves within that community. And they are living essentially what we would often call today, living a double life, such that the manipulation and the deception that's at work by that individual as a deliberate tactic within that community to hide their true intentions, to be able to operate in such a way as to target someone who's vulnerable, perhaps isolate them and prey upon them. Jesus is talking about someone who is using intentional manipulation and deception. And the key is that it's not just directed at the targeted vulnerable person. It's directed at within the entire community. And as I explain that and talk through what Jesus is saying here, again, that's exactly what experts or researchers on abuse will talk about today in terms of basic abuse dynamics. And this is the reality that we as church leaders have to account for. A lot of focus today in churches is on policies related to our kids programming hour or youth group hour, and that is absolutely important. But notice the dynamics here. This is about the life of the community and what's going on within the entire community life together. And so prevention and accounting for prevention, and certainly response would be included, how we think about it must be, in our view at Grace, shaped by these words of Jesus and this reality of someone who's known within a community, someone who's operating with intentional, calculated deception And that is the reality of abuse that we are called to confront as leaders and work against within our communities. Jesus also famously said, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, therefore be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Of course, we are to be innocent and not prey upon others as leaders, but certainly Jesus is calling us to more. And he's calling us to be wise as serpents, to be informed, to be educated, and to take an active role as leaders. In our view, that's what Jesus is calling us to. Now, again, this is what abuse experts say today. One very well-known researcher, and her work is foundational to understanding these issues because she did the work of interviewing offender after offender after offender, those who have abused power against children and adults in communities like churches, in interview after interview. So Dr. Anna Salter said, look, it's precisely our lack of knowledge that gives predators their edge. That sounds a lot to me like Jesus saying, be wise as serpents. And to me, as a Christian, that gives me a lot of encouragement to know that Jesus has been saying these things, that we have these resources within our own faith tradition to draw upon, which is exactly what experts and researchers in the field are calling us to think about today. Dr. Salter, at another point in her famous book, Predators, not light reading, by the way, and not something you would read if you're focusing on self-care. But she says, look, offenders can recognize ideal settings for abuse, even if the rest of us can't. And that, again, is a hard reality to think about as a leader, that we have that depth of responsibility to educate ourselves to be wise as serpents about what are those dynamics within an organization, within an institution, that we as leaders are responsible for, that we can shape, that discourages offending, that works toward prevention, and certainly works toward holding any who abuse power accountable. There is another researcher, Dr. Jennifer Fried, and she has developed language that I think is just so wonderful and helpful. She talks about those within an organization who have suffered individually abuse of power and how the institution has responded. If the institution responds to protect and hold others accountable, that is just a tremendous experience often for the survivor. And she calls the things we want to see organizations doing institutional courage. So she says, look, it's an institution's commitment, institutional courage is an institution's commitment to seek the truth and engage in moral action, despite unpleasantness, risk, and short-term cost. Now, as far as I know, she's not a practicing Christian, but to me, that sounds an awful lot like Jesus, seeking the truth, engaging in moral action, despite unpleasantness, risk, bearing the cost for the sake of others, to be protective, to be a place of healing. And she goes on to say, it's a pledge to protect and care for those who depend on the institution. So this is what we're called to as leaders and what we'll be talking about today. Sadly, when a survivor of abuse of power, maybe they come forward or the abuse of power comes to light, and they can, and many have experienced a betrayal from institutions and leaders. And that is such a devastating experience. Just think about these examples. These are heavy examples, but just think, these are stories that we are engaged with and we hear, again, on a weekly basis in our ministry. Just think about this example and think about the betrayal that is experienced. A teenager in a church is assaulted by an adult. The pastor and her parents don't understand it as an assault or as abuse. They quite wrongly just view it as a sexual sin that the teenager participated in with the adult, and that both of them share blame. She, as a teenager, is made to attend church with her abuser. It's not reported to law enforcement. There's no consequences, significant consequences for the adult. But she suffers deep trauma, not only from the assault, but from having to attend church weekly with her abuser. As an adult, this survivor still loves her pastor. She loves her parents. She realizes now, though, as an adult, that they just didn't know any better. They didn't have the proper education or categories or training to respond well. And so, regardless of that and her kind heart towards her pastor and parents, she still lives today with the consequences of that trauma, including struggling with depression and panic attacks. And understandably, she struggles with deep guilt and shame over that event. And she struggles to feel loved and safe in church. So again, think about the betrayal she experienced, not intentional, not malicious, but nevertheless a betrayal. Just one more story. A pastor grooms an adult woman who comes to him for counseling, and he sexually abuses her, crosses a sexual boundary in those counseling sessions with this adult. When the church discovers his abuse, they talk to the congregation about him having an affair, and they minimize and excuse the abuse. He is resigned, he is reassigned to another ministry position. The victim is blamed by many in the church for tempting the pastor, and the congregation views this as largely her fault. She, of course, leaves the church and struggles with her relationship with God to this day. And I said one more, but let me just give one other that I think is a helpful story for framing some of the things we want to talk about today. So again, now one more, one final story. When an adult comes to a senior pastor at the church, this adult tells the senior pastor at the church about the sexual abuse he suffered as a child from a former assistant pastor. The pastor is kind and nice to the young man who is now living in another state. After the conversation, the senior pastor calls the church legal counsel to get advice on what to do next. The attorney tells the pastor that the law only requires him to report the abuse if it happened within the last 3 years, according to his state's mandated reporting laws. And this happened 15 years ago. The pastor does not report the abuse or take any further action. Meanwhile, there are 8 other victims of this former assistant pastor, none of which the church is aware. Of these, 7 have left the church. Most struggle with addiction and depression or other mental health injury. 1 has died by suicide. So those are heavy stories. And many of those individuals experience not only egregious abuses of power, but some form of institutional betrayal, where leaders did not respond in a way that were protective, in ways that were healing, in ways that sought accountability for those who have abused power, who validated the experience of the survivor by simply, as a starting point, naming what it properly was, as abuse, not as an affair, not as a sexual sin, but as an abuse of power. So these stories, again, are weighty. And the goal of this training is that we realize the power we have as leaders to shape churches that are part of the solution. Those stories were of churches not having the education and tools they needed, and so they were contributing to the problem. Our goal is to be positive and say, here are the things we can be doing and working on as leaders that really do make a difference, that help validate and uphold the dignity of each and every person, that create a positive environment of safety and respect, which is what Jesus calls us to do. So as heavy as this is, to me, there is just tremendous hope in a training like this, that we as leaders are talking about these issues together. We are making a difference in shifting culture. All right, let's take a step back, take a breath, and just ask a very simple and straightforward question. That is a very important question. What is abuse? What are we talking about? Let's get on the same page with this notion of using a word like abuse, because of course some people use abuse in very different ways and they mean different things by it. So let's talk about what we are talking about when we say the word abuse. In church, we say things like we are all sinners, And I say amen to that. Of course, we are all sinners, and yet abuse is not a sin like other sins. Abuse is a particularly egregious type of sin. Abuse occurs when a person in a position of power and typically trust uses that position to exploit or violate a person who's more vulnerable. They're using a person who's more vulnerable for themselves, to exploit them in some way, to gratify themselves sexually. And of course, abuse can be sexual, can be physical, can be emotional or spiritual or financial. And of course, there are other dimensions as well, encompassing the range of human experience. So abuse of power, again, in general, and why it's a more egregious and damaging type of sin is because it depends upon that close relationship and the power that and trust that someone holds in the life of another person. And that is the mechanism or the vehicle by which a person can get close enough to exploit or use that person in a very dehumanizing or objectifying way. So that's what abuse is. It's not just any type of harm. It's not just any type of sin. It's a particularly harmful type of sin for that very reason, because it is that deep betrayal of power and trust that is used against a person who is more vulnerable, often rendering them powerless in that abuse. So basic child abuse statistics, and we'll talk about different forms of abuse today. According to a very thorough study conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, a very well-known study called the ACE study often. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Within that study, which is an adult retrospective study, in the US, we see that for sexual abuse, it's about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men experience sexual abuse before they turn 18. So in about 20% of the people in my church and in your church, this is their experience. And again, that's a very conservative number. Physical abuse. It's about 1 in 4 children in the US experience physical abuse. Now, physical abuse, it can occur in an environment of discipline, and many physically abusive events with children begin in a context of a parent disciplining a child or spanking a child. Spanking is not on its own necessarily abusive according to most and typically all state laws still. However, when it goes beyond certain boundaries, whether it's in that context or not, physical abuse is typically defined as non-accidental physical injury. And of course, there's a range from bruising to other severe injuries, but it's non-accidental physical injuries or non-injurious contact with the goal of intimidating or threatening or controlling a child. Emotional abuse is experienced by about 1 in 10 kids. Emotional abuse is typically defined as a pattern of controlling or coercive behaviors, and it manifests in a variety of ways, that pattern of behaviors, but it includes a lot of times shaming, insulting, degrading, intimidating, threatening, humiliating children, domineering children. And then neglect, of course, can take forms like physical neglect, failing to provide food or shelter. Again, not when poverty is the root issue of that, but when a parent or caregiver can provide those things. It can also be medical and educational and take other forms as well. Certainly, the other side of the coin of emotional abuse is emotional neglect. And that's when a child is not told positively, you are loved, you are safe. And that is so important for the healthy development of children to experience in their home. And then certainly spiritual abuse is essentially, and that's not covered in the ACE study, so I don't have a statistic on that, but spiritual abuse is essentially a form of emotional abuse. So it would be a pattern of coercive or controlling behaviors, often related to humiliation, insulting, shaming, threatening, But the difference is that it's using spiritual ideas and language and concepts from religion. So it's abuse in a religious environment with that emotionally controlling pattern of behaviors using spirituality. So using God, using theology, using the Bible to control and harm and silence is typically what we would define spiritual abuse as. Now, I recognize there's a lot more nuance we could bring to those, but for the sake of time, and sexual abuse, of course, would be any sexual contact or non-sexual act between an adult and a child, or an older child and a child where there's a significant difference in development or age. And certainly, even if there's not a difference in development or age, where there are coercive acts or assaulting acts, those can be, of course, abusive as well. Beyond child abuse, just a couple of more broad statistics and a couple of major forms of abuse. In the US, the American Medical Association believes that about 1 in 3 women will experience some form of intimate partner violence, often called domestic violence, from a partner in her lifetime. So that is, again, a significant number within our church communities. And then for clergy sexual abuse, a couple of experts in this area in their book, Marie Fortune and James Poling, looking at a broad range of surveys, a broad range of research studies, conclude that likely about 10% or even a little more of clergy commit clergy sexual abuse, cross a sexual boundary. And of course, that would be with a child, but also with an adult, where the pastor, the clergy, has a spiritual responsibility of caring for the congregant. So when a sexual boundary is crossed within that caring relationship, within that power dynamic, that is an abuse of power. And it's not an affair. That's not the right terminology. Certainly, it could be considered a sin generally, or adultery generally, but that's usually not the right terminology in communicating what is actually going on, and making sure everyone understands that that is an abuse of power, and that it is the responsibility of the person in power and not the responsibility of the person who's been victimized by that abuse of power. So clergy sexual abuse is not an affair. It is vital that we change the habits we've had in the church of naming things such. Now, many states, by the way, have begun to change their laws. Now, assault is always a crime in every state, but many states, and that represented in red, and there's actually, this is not updated, Tennessee has also recently changed their laws, but even when there is not an assault or coercion, that is a physical coercion, these states have changed their laws such that if a pastor has spiritual authority and responsibility over an adult, even if there's a crossing of a sexual boundary, then they consider that now in certain states a crime. Now, in my state, it's not. In New York State, to my knowledge, it is not, or Pennsylvania. However, there are laws in New York State about a counselor crossing sexual boundaries, or therapist. And again, you would need to make sure you are responsible and understand those laws. But regardless of whether those laws are in place, we in the church must commit to understanding that any kind of clergy abuse, and certainly sexual abuse, is a deep betrayal. And we must commit, even though it might not be illegal according to the laws of our state, we must commit to holding abusive leaders accountable, naming it properly, and seeking to name and bring accountability that's appropriate to the situation. Now, the common dynamics that we see, that we've already named in large part, like with the words of Jesus, power and trust, we see those talked about in the Bible over and over and over again. So I just want to give you one prominent example of that. There's a lament in Ecclesiastes where it talks about oppression that is occurring. And I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun. Behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors, there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. So notice the oppression, the exploitation, the abuse of power that's occurring here is tied directly to power and this issue of power as a key core dynamic of what's happening, and that there is a powerlessness experienced by those who are being exploited. And of course, that's the basis of this lament of crying out to God and asking for help, because there's no one who has power who is stepping in to help. And so these dynamics, these core dynamics that we've already named, and other core dynamics in the Bible, oppression upon oppression, deceit, deception, is always connected in the Bible to abuse of power, to oppression of others, exploitation of others. Again and again, those core dynamics are named, and we're not going to go through all the verses. We don't have time, but that's just a couple of examples. But to summarize, and now we're going to walk through a scenario, and I'm going to get you to interact in this scenario, and we're just going to practice naming some of these core common dynamics of abuse that we've already named in large part. That abuse involves power that someone holds in the life of another who's more vulnerable, and they hold power in the community. There's trust, not just trust within an individual relationship, but trust that's held within the community. That there's entitlement by those who abuse power. They feel entitled to dehumanize, to exploit, to violate, to use someone else and objectify them, dehumanize them. And that's, again, very harmful. The deception and manipulation that we've named. Isolation often is a key dynamic, isolating someone, getting them away from someone who could help and intervene, rendering them powerless. And often it's not just physical isolation or physically rendering them powerless, but using tactics of fear and shame to render them powerless, to maintain secrecy and silence in the situation. So those are common core dynamics of abuse of power typically. So I'm going to read this situation here, and I'm going to just ask that you take it all in. And then if anyone would like to notice something or point something out that you think is important, if you want to point that out, and especially if you can connect it to that list we just used, that would be wonderful. So here's the situation. A youth seeks out the help of his youth pastor regarding his depression. His parents are getting divorced, and he's taking this very hard. The pastor gets the parents' permission to meet regularly with the youth, to talk, to do Bible study, and pray. Eventually, the pastor convinces him to do counseling sessions, quote unquote, and Bible study in the nude with him and masturbate together. The pastor tells him, God needs you to trust him completely. The youth is confused by all of this, but he trusts this youth pastor, and he's embarrassed and scared to tell anyone. The pastor says he can't tell anyone, or the ministry will suffer and people might go to hell because of him. All right, so given this little vignette, what are some of the things that stand out to you in terms of what's going on here? What stands out to you that you think is important for everyone to notice? And can you connect that to those common core dynamics that we've been talking about? So if you want to unmute and jump in, please do so.
Power and vulnerability.
Yeah. And how is this youth vulnerable? and why? They're vulnerable because they're a youth.
Mm-hmm.
Every youth, every child, every minor is vulnerable because of their place and how they're developing. You know, they're still a human in development largely. So that means they're vulnerable in various ways. But what else is going on circumstantially that directly relates to his vulnerability?
In the chat, somebody says pastor, position of authority, and sexual inappropriateness.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the power the youth pastor holds. There is the vulnerability of the child, and circumstantially the child is vulnerable, the youth is vulnerable, right? And that's a good lesson for all of us. Now, you can't tell on the Zoom call, but I'm 6'8", and not many people would look at me and say, Mike, you're vulnerable in many ways, physically speaking. But if I'm grieving, if I'm sick, all of us as adults are circumstantially vulnerable in various ways, even if it's not in some of the more obvious ways. But certainly this youth is more vulnerable because of what his parents are going through, because of the depression he's experiencing. And, all of this is making him even more vulnerable than he was before. All right, good. What else do you notice in the situation?
More in the chat says fear and secrecy and silence. Also the permission that the parents give, the manipulation, the misrepresentation of the character of God.
Yeah, good. What else do you notice?
I think getting permission from the parents is striking in a couple ways, because not only does he establish trust with them, but I think it's going to make the teen feel more isolated and fearful about speaking out, because
Right.
this is something that his parents have approved.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and for some, especially, youth or even younger children, well, they just assume if they've gotten parental permission, this must be okay. Some will assume that, not all. Certainly grooming as a constellation of tactics that abusers use very often. We know from research that grooming is not just directed towards those who are targeted as victims, but caregivers are targeted very often by grooming behaviors. And certainly there has been a developing of a relationship and a developing of trust with the parents. Certainly that's the case here. What else do you notice?
From the chat, we also have the guilt and shame about others going to hell if they speak out. The isolation, the threats.
Yeah.
Somebody else
Yeah.
added, there are implications not just in trauma about the situation, but the connection to the divorce.
Sure. Yeah, notice the tactics to control and keep silence, to maintain fear and secrecy. Very often in a church setting, the most powerful tools that can be deployed are the spiritual tools and the language of the Bible, the language of the spiritual community. That is powerful to a kid who has grown up in church or has been in church, right? That makes quite an impression. And many children, if their pastor says it, they have no ability to distinguish. Well, this must be what God is saying. And notice how the abuser in this scenario is basically conflating himself and God. God needs you to trust him completely. What is the person here abusing power getting at? Essentially, you need to trust me completely is what he's saying, but not saying. And that's very powerful. Do you see dehumanization? Anyone see that? Where do you see that? Or entitlement?
Well, essentially, he's treating him as a sexual object. He's gaining sexual pleasure from that relationship and manipulation.
And that's just absolutely right. And that's an incredibly dehumanizing act. That's harmful, incredibly harmful. And it's an attitude of entitlement. I'm going to do what I want and take what I want and use you in a way for my own gratification. Incredibly entitled mentality and incredibly callous. This is not a mistake. It's not just a moment of temptation. This is a very deliberate crossing of a sexual boundary, abusing power. And it's based on an incredibly entitled mentality, and it's incredibly dehumanizing to use another person in this way. It's very devastating.
In the chat room, someone specifically mentions dehumanization by them being in the nude.
Yeah, and certainly, absolutely, that's the case. And I don't know how many times we've heard and talk to pastors who the offender's been telling them, oh, I was educating the child on sexuality. I was helping the child understand their sexuality. I was just trying to, I was not trying to gratify myself. They would flat out just lie directly about that. I was just counseling them. I was just helping them. That's very often, you get very direct lies to test if the pastor will accept it or minimize it or excuse it in some way to see if the leader will accept it. And we're often in a position advising the clergy in the situation. Yep, that's a lie. Don't believe it. That wasn't their goal, just to educate the child. That's not what they're doing. They were using the child for their own gratification. So don't get taken in. And notice, again, all of the power and trust that's held, it's not just power and trust over this individual. It's power and trust held in that community. And for that youth to think, well, how would I even start to talk about this with anybody, about what our youth pastor is doing? And of course, there's a direct threat, right? That you can't do this. And that's very powerful for a child and a youth in a setting like that. All right, there's no way, we're not going to exhaust a situation like that, but let's keep moving. And let's just start to name a few things in terms of, given this reality we've been talking about, how does prevention work? And I'm just going to tell you a story. I was conducting a training very much like this with a large church. And after that training, I got a call from one of the pastors, and he said, Mike, here's what's going on. After your training, one of our leaders, an elder, was talking to a parent, a mom, about the training we just did, and just mentioned that we did this training as leaders. And the mom said, oh, you did a training on abuse prevention. Well, I want to tell you something I saw the other day at the youth group Christmas party. I was there as a chaperone, as a parent, and it was the junior high Christmas party. And I noticed this male volunteer walk past a junior high girl, and he reached out his hand and he just caressed down her cheek in a way that made me uncomfortable. And it clearly made the junior high girl uncomfortable. She didn't say anything, but she showed with her body language. She did not appreciate it or like it. And I saw it and I was uncomfortable. And I watched that man the rest of the night. And he did it 2 more times, 3 times total, to this junior high girl. And I didn't know who to talk to about this. But you brought up this training you did. And so now I'm telling you. So then the pastor, the elder tells the pastor went to the youth group leaders and said, this is what this parent saw. Have you seen anything concerning related to this volunteer, this 40-something-year-old man who volunteers with our youth group? Do you have any concerns, or have you seen anything concerning? And the youth group leaders listed 6 or 7 things that they were concerned with this person. And the pastor calls me to say, yes, there are general, and the pastor said there are 6 or 7 general concerns. And I said, okay, what are they? And he listed things. And I said, those don't sound general at all. Those sound very specific things that they've observed that are concerning. So we talked through the scenario. In that situation, we can't tell a church what to do. Like, we have no authority. I have to help them realize if someone is testing boundaries in that way, demonstrating concerning behavior over and over and over again, that is not a safe person to be working with youth as a starting point minimum. And we might need further boundaries for their continued presence in the community. But given that story, what are some of the things that occur to you that really make the difference in terms of effective prevention as leaders? What are the things we have to account for or think of in terms of effective prevention in a church environment? So what are some of the things that come to your mind that really make a difference?
Are you referring to like never having a leader alone with a youth or a child?
Sure. That's a great boundary to have in place in your community. So a
Mhm.
lot of abuse occurs in isolated one-on-one situations. So having a boundary like that in place is a good prevention measure. Excellent. What else?
I think having a clear system of reporting,
Mhm.
so that way, if anyone sees anything that's concerning, they know exactly who to talk to about that.
That's right. And not just a mechanism for if there's a reporting of abuse scenario, but a mechanism for if you have a concern or if someone is violating our policy or demonstrating some form of concerning behavior, like in the story I just told. The parent, that mom, she saw it, she was concerned, but the leaders had not taken the step of clarifying the mechanism for her to raise that concern in a safe way. And for many, it's a hard thing to do, to say something, especially when it's someone you know. That's not an easy thing to do. So it's not just permission that we as leaders must establish. Beyond permission, responsibility. We need to make it positive. We all have a positive responsibility as adults to be protective that God calls us to. So making that a part of our cultivating that in our community is really critical to prevention and response. Good. What else?
In the chat, we have ongoing training for leaders so they know what to recognize, as well
Yes.
as train the youth to understand what to expect from their leaders.
That's right. And youth, children, education for children and youth are critical. Now, that's never going to be our main strategy because many children and youth are just still not going to be able to articulate a concern when it's someone they know and trust to another adult. But absolutely some will. And we must begin to educate them. And I'll say more about that later in the training. And then so you're naming all the things: education, training, clear mechanisms for speaking up, for accountability, policies that have good boundaries in place that apply to the whole community. All of those things are critical. And we'll continue to fill out that picture as we go along. But to me, it's just helpful to begin to name some of those pieces. And then as we end out this first section here in the next couple of minutes, this is the tool that we like to give to church leaders to say, here are the main areas when we talk about a culture that supports effective prevention and response. We talk about cultivating a mentality within your church community for effective prevention and response. The four main areas that we want leaders, again, four because we need to keep it simple. And these are the four main areas in our view. We have to ground these issues in our Christian faith commitments. If we're doing these things to check off a box because our insurance company has said we have to do this, we're never going to get there. We have to ground this in the mentality and the teaching and the heart of Jesus. Second, education. We have to raise the education level of everyone in the community. So we just talked about kids and youth, but also the adults. Most churches are training or having policies in place for adults that work directly with kids. Most churches have that in place, I would say, in this day and age, at least on some level. But that's not enough. We have to actually bring more education to the whole community. We have to engage all the adults, at least on some level, because that is accounting for how most abuse actually occurs. Most abuse does not occur in youth group hour or kids worship hour or Sunday school hour, although occasionally it does happen in those settings. Most abuse occurs in unstructured times and in homes. So for us to make significant progress in our church communities with prevention and response, we have to broaden our educational efforts and give prevention tools to our community that we can take wherever we are and wherever we go. Third is clear boundaries, expectations for conduct. Like with this story I told about the youth group Christmas party, that we respect personal space and we don't touch without permission, even if it's not in itself abusive touch. If touch is not welcomed by an adult or a child, we should respect that. and there should be an expectation as a church that we are a place of safety and respect. And we talk about boundaries and touch and personal space and not having sexual conversations with minors about our experiences or making jokes, things like that, basic boundaries for the whole community. And then we work on accountability so that there are clear mechanisms for articulating concerns, for speaking up if there's a policy violation, and certainly protocols for reporting abuse in certain cases, child abuse, and in some cases, adult abuse. So we're going to fill out this picture throughout the rest of the training, but just naming these core issues here for us as leaders is critical. And so that's going to be articulated for you in the slides. So in terms of what we mean by shifting culture at Grace, when we talk to you all as church leaders, again, the key is that our approach must begin with the teaching of Jesus, not managing risk for the institution. The story I articulated earlier. The pastor called the lawyer. The lawyer said, "You don't legally have to do anything about this." And the pastor said, "Well, that's it. I'm done." That's not, of course, what we're called to be as church leaders. Our legal responsibility is not the only consideration. In fact, the primary consideration is always ethical obligations we're called to by Jesus. And so with education, again, shifting culture means that we're educating not just the volunteers we're required to who work directly with kids by our insurance company, and in some cases by the law. It's educating the entire community, and that's adults and kids. And so we'll talk more about that in the training today. And then certainly, again, articulating clear expectations for conduct and making it positive that we are a place of safety and respect because of Jesus. And so that means if someone doesn't want to be touched, we respect that. We respect the policies related to assisting kids in the restroom because we want to be a place of safety and a place of transparency and accountability. And we have strong mechanisms for accountability for those testing boundaries, for those violating the policy. And we have strong protocols that are more trauma-informed, that don't seek simply to protect us as an institution or only worry about our legal accountability or legal requirements. We go beyond that because we are Christians and we want to see accountability. We want to see truth. We want to see justice. All right. So these, again, 4 key areas are, in our view, this is just a very simple rubric for leaders to take with you, to hold on to say, we have to cultivate these areas. These don't just happen. These don't just happen. It takes deliberate cultivation to shape an environment where these are working well. And the key, again, is that this is not just something we hand to our kids director or youth director and they take care of it all. That's not how prevention works. It's about a community embracing the beauty of treating one another well, the beauty of being protective of others, the beauty of all of us being accountable and being transparent. And that is, again, what Jesus calls us to. So these 4 key areas lived out as a community together. All right, we're a few minutes over. Let's take our first 10-minute break. And I'm going to start my timer and I will see you in 10 minutes.
Mike, before we
Yes.
take a break,
Yeah,
can
yeah.
I just would like to pray with all those statistics. Okay, and then
Yes,
we'll break.
please.
Lord Jesus, I think about all of those statistics that Mike has shared, and my heart is heavy. And so we pray for anybody on this call that is part of those numbers, but we also pray for everybody in our churches that has been wounded in some way, shape, or form by abuse. And we ask that you would be that we would be journeying with them in healing, and that today would be helpful to us in that journey as well. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. See you in 10 minutes.